and a warm welcome to all of you from Network 18 and the Observer Research Foundation for the curtain event, the India-US Dialogues Setting the Agenda on the historic event of President Obama's visit to India for our Republic Day. Now, just for our live audience who's at the event, I'm going to make a few announcements. Essentially, this room is going to become a live studio for the next 56 minutes, so I would request you to keep your phones on silent, for you not to talk or walk about while the show is taping. Can you also not use any flash photography? If you are tweeting, please use the hashtag #NamasteObama. And finally, I would like to invite our panel up on stage and turn the floor over to Sarkar Jacob, who is Deputy Executive Editor at CNN IBN. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
Welcome to this one-of-a-kind initiative by Network 18 and the Observer Research Foundation, the India-US Dialogues, where we are setting the agenda ahead of President Barack Obama and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's meeting on Sunday, where they'll have the bilateral summit. We're trying to get ideas from our panel, and I think we possibly have the best minds from the United States and India to discuss and debate what the agenda is going to be, what the way forward is going to be. So let me introduce my panel. On my immediate left, Dr. C. Rajamohan, Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Somebody calls him the Bhishma Pitama of Indian strategy and security policy. On his left is Vikram Singh, former Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense, now Vice President for the Center for American Progress, and possibly in the future, Defense Secretary of the United States if Hillary Clinton were to be the next president. To his left, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who we're all familiar with, former ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France, and a man who is very closely involved with the nuclear negotiations that India is currently having. On his left is Peter Tishansky. He is the President and CEO of the Business Council for International Understanding, also was part of the USIBC, so he knows everything that there is to know about trade and commerce. And finally, to his left is Rick Rosso. He is the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So welcome to Network 18 and to this ORF event. I'll start with Dr. Rajamohan. Why don't you start off by laying the broad framework for us on where the India-US bilateral relationship stands right now, and what are going to be the big talking points, if you will, when President Obama and Prime Minister Modi meet?
I think there are two things. One is the symbolism, and the other is the substance. Now, this is the second summit, barely 4 months. Now, as you know, Mr. Modi went to Washington in September. President Obama had invited him to the White House very quickly after his election. So they took the first opportunity to meet then. I think that what that meeting did was to arrest the drift in the bilateral relationship, because what seemed to peak in 2005, 2006, we seemed a steady loss of momentum in the following years. So I think with the new Prime Minister, with a strong majority in the Parliament, was now signaling that, look, he's ready to take a fresh look at the entire relationship.
All right.
And Obama, on his part, said, look, let's go ahead. So I think if that summit helped arrest the drift, this one, I think, is going to focus on how do you advance the relationship. And essentially 4 areas which are looking at. One is trade and economics. One is resolving the outstanding disputes on the nuclear front. Then you have expanding defense cooperation. And then, which is a very important issue for the Americans, the question of climate change. Can we find some common ground?
True. Vikram, you know, as somebody who's been engaged with diplomatic talks whenever big countries deal with each other, you think the managing public expectations, especially when you have a big visit such as this, is one of the core areas to focus. And how do you manage that when people are talking about deals and deliverables and so on?
First, let me just thank you all for this initiative. This is a great forum, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. Managing public expectations is one piece. Actually, managing the expectations of our officials on both sides is actually the other piece within this relationship.
Does one outrun the other?
I think they're both a significant challenge. In reality, there's always been a sense of dissatisfaction somehow on one side or the other, except at the sort of most perfect moments in the U.S.-India relationship. So even Raja says, you know, we sort of plateaued in 2005. Well, on the defense front in 2005, we still had zero defense trade. We've ticked up over $10 billion in defense trade as of this year. And I think that, so you see...
America is India's largest defense supplier, which in itself
for the first time last year, that actually became true. I don't know if it'll stay true. But the point is that if there was a plateau, it was a positive plateau. We were at a good place. The bilateral relationship is fundamentally strong. The question has been, can it keep a really good, strong upward trajectory, or is it going to be sort of stuck at this relatively good level? So it's kind of a good or great debate, not a
good or bad debate
about problems.
Ambassador Sood, somehow over the last 10 years or so, and Dr. Rajamohan referred to this as well, there was this high point with the nuclear deal which happened 2004-2005, and then there was this drift. Are we now coming back to a situation where the deal and whatever progress there might be on that deal is now a barometer of the relationship itself?
Well, I think as Vikram said and as Dr. Rajamohan said, you know, whenever there are transformative moments in relationships between countries, it needs high-level commitment from the top leadership. We've seen that in the past. If you go back and look at Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit in 1998 after the nuclear tests, we find that before that, the term that was used was invariably estranged democracies. Prime Minister Vajpayee changed it in one stroke to natural allies. And then we had the Clinton visit, which was an incredibly successful visit in 2000. You know, then we had a situation once again in 2005 when the first part of the nuclear deal was done. I mean, the nuclear deal actually took 3 years to complete. But the first part, in the sense where the US committed to engaging full cooperation in civil nuclear sector, happened in 2005. And President Bush was very clear. He had a vision of a strong India being very much a source of stability in the region and beyond. Now, that's where the personal commitment comes in. Now, we saw that again with Prime Minister Modi when he went to Washington. And at that time, it was agreed that both sides will set up this contact group to deal with the nuclear issue, which had not moved forward, particularly after the 2010 liability bill, which the Liability Act that India had adopted. So now I think with President Obama following, I mean, the two meetings taken, two summit-level exchanges taking place so quickly, one after the other, and let's not forget that in between the two leaders have had an occasion to meet at the East Asia Summit in Myanmar. They've had an occasion to meet at the G20 Summit in Australia. So it's not there has been an intensification of dialogue. And to that extent, I think there is a certain commitment to taking the relationship forward and resolving the obstacles that remain in operationalizing the civil nuclear cooperation.
Peter, again, just to take forward the point that Ambassador Sood was making, is there too much of a focus on deals and deliverables as opposed to the organic nature of this relationship itself? Let's say, for example, in the business and commerce area, there are different philosophies with which Indian companies approach business and commerce and which American companies approach. In your experience in dealing with Indian and American companies and the business councils, how do you match synergies?
Yes, I mean, the transformative moment this trip that New York, right?
Just speak into the mic. Thank you.
India is on the agenda again for business. And there was a time when you could have a fully developed global strategy as a company and not have to do business with India. Too hard. And I think that this trip and then the election of the Prime Minister changes that. There's almost an irrational exuberance, to quote Alan Greenspan, that has come with the Prime Minister's election. What Alan Greenspan meant was that sometimes assets gear up in value, and that could cause the whole market to overvalue assets. So there's a positive aspect to it, and there's a cautionary aspect to it. But to answer your question, from the point of view of this trip, whether there are clear deliverables or not is really secondary to the fact that India is back high on people's mind.
All right.
And a consistent commentary that I received really since last year
has been to that end. Rick, obviously this is a bilateral engagement by and large, but they are going to be spending a large amount of time behind closed doors in Hyderabad House, talking about the regional situation, the evolving security architecture. I want to start off with the AFPAC region, which is obviously going to be a concern. What is it that, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, what is it that the United States wants to see India do more in that country as the troop drawdown? One part of it got over last year, and we're looking at further drawdown in the years ahead. And as far as Pakistan is concerned, you know what India's position is and where we stand on that front. Are we on the same page, really, when it comes to terror in Pakistan? They've recently had the ban on the Jamaat-ud-Dawa. People here are not entirely convinced. So why don't you take both, Afghanistan and then Pakistan?
I think on Afghanistan, actually, the United States is not going to be the demandor so much as probably India is. I think it's more of a question of India wants to know better about what our plans are for the future in Afghanistan. As India shapes its own agenda in terms of giving to Afghanistan development aid, they want to make sure that it's in conformity with what our footprint will look like, because the security blanket that we provide, as long as we provide it, is a critical element for what you do and where you go. So actually on Afghanistan, I think India has the tougher questions to raise, rightly so. On Pakistan, I think at the leadership level, and this isn't, I think, generally shared in the Indian public to my understanding, I think at the leadership level they understand that, you know, the United States is going to have to maintain some relationship with Pakistan. And particularly, you know, you talk about the Peshawar, the horrific Peshawar attack.
Yeah.
And some look at that and say, well, is that going to, how is that going to alter what Pakistan will or will not do in the future against terrorism? But actually the attack is seen by most as a reaction to the ongoing military campaign against militants in Waziristan, which the Pentagon says has dramatically slowed cross-border terrorism into Afghanistan, where we have a shared interest. So I think, you know, with Pakistan, clearly it'll be on the talking points. It'll be, you know, something that they want to exchange messages on. But at the same time, you know, this is one of the moments that we've seen Pakistan, at least in Waziristan, take a sustained military campaign against militants. India would like that to be expanded to make sure that it also cuts off cross-border this way.
You want to add a quick...
I just wanted to jump in. I think actually there's an example here of where the public discourse has not kept pace with how the U.S.-India private, behind-the-scenes, government-to-government discussions happen. We're extraordinarily clear with each other now about what we see happening in Afghanistan, about how we interpret where Pakistan is going. Okay. Those discussions behind closed doors, I think, have taken a different tenor over the last several years. Not a brand new.
Why is it they're not getting reflected in the public discourse?
I think the public discourse is there's two pieces of it. One is the deep history and the deep sort of habits of thinking, and the other is that I think, quite frankly, it's a better story in the media to look at the differences, and so you don't really see.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I think Pakistan is always. We had always argued about Pakistan. I think when it came to Pakistan, India and the US talked past each other, not talked to each other. Americans would tell us, "Look, why don't you sit down and talk to them? You know, they're not so bad." We say, "Look, why don't you put more pressure on them to stop terrorism?" But I think for the first time, and I agree with Vikram, I'm sure Rakesh will have something to say. For the first time, I think we need to sit down and talk to each other about Pakistan.
All right.
Where is Pakistan going? Can we work together with Pakistan if possible, or together in the region so that the cancer that is growing in Pakistan doesn't affect everyone around? Okay. So I think we need to change the framing of the whole issue.
Why do you think that conversation hasn't happened yet?
Well, as Vikram said, I think there is a certain history. You know, if you recall going back to the first presidential visit to the region, which was President Eisenhower, it was around the time that Pakistan then was a member of the Baghdad Pact and then CENTO and so on. And it became part of the US-led military alliance structures. Now, after 1962, there was a slight shift because the US then began defense supplies to India. But then after 1965, the India-Pakistan war of 65, it all stopped. And so there has been a long history of stop and go and stop and go. But I would say that in the world of diplomacy, I think where you stand on an issue depends very much on where you sit. And today, when you look at India, you know, you sit straddling the Indian Ocean, and on the western side, you have a complete arc of instability starting from Pakistan, going all the way to the Gulf and Middle East.
That's right.
On the eastern side, you have a very crowded geopolitical space where major powers are jostling for influence and their position. Now, here, what happens is that because we sit where we are, our stand on this is obviously going to be slightly different from, let's say, that of the United States, which is thousands and thousands of kilometers away, especially now that they've decided to cease combat operations. I think the key here lies in the US listening very carefully to India and to Indian perceptions on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the implications of that, because we know this region. This is our region.
All right.
This is our backyard.
Ambassador Sood talked about, and I want Rick to weigh in on this, he talked about the western flank, if you will. There's also a huge attention being given to the eastern flank with the rise of China. Is it naive for us to think that India and the United States, or even an arc of countries, can contain or confront China? Wouldn't it be rather better to try and shape the environment in which China is going to rise to ensure that there is no change to the status quo? And if they do try, then the cost for that would be heavy.
Now, what the United States wants to see is a multipolar Asia in the future, and making sure that there's multiple poles of power, that no single country or even group of countries can dominate the Asian agenda in the future. And so, you know, will it be India tied together to block China in the future? No. The United States and India both have deep positive relations with China in some aspects, and concerns about, you know, Chinese aggressive behavior in other aspects. So we don't know which way the future is going to go, and I do think, you know, what you mentioned is correct, that we need to try to encourage, you know, the good elements in China, the good cooperation that we have, and make sure that, you know, it is a stable and prosperous region in the future for all of our countries.
Dr. Rajaman, you want to weigh in on that, managing China?
I think, as you said, I mean, look, it's not about containment. This is not about, you know, trying to build something against China. And the fact is also, on the economic side, the US and China have a much deeper relation.
Oh, absolutely.
Than India has either with America or with China.
Yeah.
So in a sense, the India strategy, I think, would be to keep growing its relation with both the countries. And that we need to, for example, there's some things only the Chinese do. Americans have stopped building bridges and roads and that kind of stuff. The Chinese are the ones we're going to turn to for infrastructure investment. But on security side, of course, we're going to do more with the Americans, because Americans don't sell weapons to the Chinese, and Americans are willing to sell it to us. So I think it is a complex, complicated relationship. And as Mr. Modi has shown, he was very eager to engage Mr. Xi Jinping, even deeper cooperation with the Americans. So I think we must see ourselves as one of the major powers trying to shape the region.
Okay.
You know, the trade relationship, let me just point out real quick, though.
Quickly.
It is a, you know, one of those things that I think also pulls us apart, because the United States has a massive trade deficit with China, but we also got a big trade deficit with India.
Yeah.
India's got a massive trade deficit with China.
With China.
So,
just give me a moment. I'm going to take a break for our TV viewers. We'll continue this fascinating conversation about this emerging trilateral, if you will, between India, United States, and China. We'll also extend this to other areas of the Indo-US relationship. Defense is going to be a big portion of the bilateral summit when President Obama and Prime Minister Modi sit down in Hyderabad House. Quick break. Back in a couple of minutes. All right, welcome back to this special initiative by Network 18 and the Observer Research Foundation, the India-US dialogues, hoping to set the agenda for President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. We're not going to talk about the defense relationship, and I can start with Peter, if I may. Peter, the defense relationship between India and the United States has sort of grown leaps and bounds over the last 10 years, ever since the framework agreement came into existence. But it is still a very buyer-seller kind of relationship. It's a very transactional relationship. What are the hindrances you feel in terms of intellectual property rights, in terms of technology transfer, which is holding this as merely a buyer-seller business relationship rather than a collaborative, joint production, joint research kind of relationship?
Fortunately, I think the prospects are excellent in defense cooperation because it's an industry that's very closely regulated and closely watched, and the planning within it has a direct involvement of the two governments. So you don't see, I think, the risk of systemic problems in the IPR space, for example.
Okay.
So I think, and as some of our panelists have already outlined, it is a difficult neighborhood, and because the two countries are natural allies, this is probably the most exciting focal point from my perspective, and I'm really keen to see this grow.
Okay.
One small follow-up. There's an enormous opportunity after this trip concludes for the private sectors and the media on both sides to speak with the same voice, frankly, and put down some of the sort of skepticism, what were the deliverables? Because in the long run, that's not really that important in my mind.
Okay. I will get a comment a little later on in this session about, companies, the FDI has now gone up to 49% in defense. Is that incentive enough for a foreign company to come and invest? But Vikram, in terms of, changing this, transforming this relationship into a more joint collaboration, joint research, from the American point of view, what is holding back this relationship?
So I think the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, which was launched under Secretary Panetta after his visit, to New Delhi, he proposed it at the time, and it was taken up by the Indians, but I would say there was an enthusiasm gap. I think the U.S. side was extraordinarily enthusiastic, and Ash Carter, who is the nominee to be the next U.S. Secretary of Defense, put extraordinary amounts of energy into that initiative and tried to come up with a lot of concrete things we could do, and also tried to basically internally shake up the traditional system in the Pentagon and the State Department and the Commerce Department and everyone that's involved in these kinds of sensitive trade issues.
Since you mentioned Ash Carter, I'm sorry to interrupt, but how much do individuals really play, and their sort of disposition, if you will, how much does that play a role in transforming a bilateral relationship?
Personalist policy.
I think there are three levels of things that matter in taking relationships from where they are to where they could go. The first is leadership level. So that top-down leadership is an absolute imperative, and we have it now clearly on both sides in the U.S.-India relationship. And the second is the people who run those line ministries. I mean, if there is a dedicated person who's measuring their own performance on how much they get done, they'll get things done. If it's not a priority for the leadership of the relevant agency, they either won't get things done or they won't put that kind of energy into it. And so I think what we're seeing now is that there's an increased excitement on the India side. I think lifting the FDI caps was an early sign that there was a mood shift. And there's a fundamental strategic question for India here, which is, does India want to have a robust defense industry? It's going to require reform to public sector undertakings. It is going to require a lot of changes that enable India to invest in systems that often take 10, 20, 30 years to come to fruition, and that really require engagement with the rest of the world. And that engagement has to be in a way that is attractive to companies around the world.
Right. Dr. Rajamohan, I mean, what he's essentially saying in plainer language is simply that we need to rethink our own institutions, like the DRDO, for example. The Prime Minister has been pitching about Make in India, and he wants to get private sector companies and also foreign companies, particularly on the defense front, to come and manufacture stuff here in India. Where do you see that synergy going forward?
I think we're taking the first steps to we've announced some reforms, but it's going to be a long process. So I think the challenge in the summit is, look, if you agree on producing a couple of items, 4 items, 5 items, so I think start taking those small steps. Okay. So that you begin to get the two industries, because both the Indian public sector as well as the Indian private sector partnering American companies and begin to produce and then also export to the third country markets. So I think until now, we've kind of held back each other. There's been this buyer-seller relationship. Second, I think there's been a political problem as well, which was the previous government, despite the 2005 agreement, there was a hesitation to be seen doing things with the Americans.
Okay.
It's not just about weapons. I mean, the question is, do we work together in the shared region? So my sense is, if that must change too. For example, the two militaries do a lot of exercises, but they don't do any joint operations. No, but tomorrow there is a humanitarian disaster.
Yes.
There is a humanitarian assistance issue. Then I think we must begin to act together. But because the previous government was worried about alliance and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it is a practical thing that look, we do it with other countries. Once we start working together, get our militaries to say, look, there are shared objectives and we can work together for mutual benefit, then I think we cross another layer of this relationship.
Rick, I mean, one of the things that both the Indians and the Americans have to keep in mind when it comes to the defense relationship, of course, is just how frosty ties are between Moscow and Washington. And for better or for worse, Russia is our second largest defense supplier now. It's the bedrock of our defense supplies. How do both countries walk this fine line? I don't know if there are Russians here, but the Russians are not entirely happy with this emerging defense relationship between India and the United States.
I think from the United States perspective, in terms of the relationship India has with Russia, the meetings that have taken place recently, Russian promises of cooperation in new areas, at some level it's bothersome, but at the big picture right now, we don't look at that as the country that's going to come in and take away the thunder from our relationship. It's vestiges of what was there before, but I think back, right, here we are, 15 years post the visit to India of President Bill Clinton, and look back at that joint statement and see how far we've come. As Vikram was talking about on the amount of defense sales. That joint statement led with, we hope India gives up nuclear weapons. That's not likely to make it on the joint statement this time around. The agenda has changed tremendously. So, despite the fact that there still is a relationship there, there's promises, I think it's problematic to some extent because we look at Russia's aggressive activities on its borders and we wish for, India today or at some point in the future to play a more proactive role when those crises escalate. But in terms of the specifics that have been offered and pledges of cooperation, probably less bothersome than it was, a few years ago.
Okay, Ambassador Sood, since it's a TV event, in a minute, please.
I just wanted to say that while the US has emerged as a significant supplier in the last 5-6 years and has notched up $10 billion of defense sales, but in the foreseeable future, Russia will remain the major partner because it will continue to provide more than 2/3 of our defense requirements over the next decades. What we need to do, therefore, is not worry so much on that account. What we need to do is move the US-India defense relationship from the trading, merely buyer-seller thing to joint development, joint production, joint R&D, and also in terms of service-to-service cooperation, shared operational experience.
All right, that's going to be a big part of the bilateral discussions expected to feature in the joint statement in a big way. We are, of course, going to renew our agreement, the framework agreement, for another 10 years, and DTTI is going to play a big role as well in joint collaboration and joint research. We're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll talk about trade and commerce, that, of course, is a huge part of the India-US relationship. And now, more recently, and this is going to be a big thrust, climate change and renewable energy. That's going to be on the other side. Keep it right here. All right, welcome back to this very special initiative by Network 18 and the Observer Research Foundation, the India-US Dialogues. We're setting the agenda for President Obama and Prime Minister Modi in their bilateral summit. So let's talk about trade and business. And again, I'll start with you, Peter. You've seen what the new ambassador to India said recently. Currently, India and the United States trade about $100 billion, goods and services put together. They want to take it up to 5 times that by the end of the decade. You think that's achievable? Would that be in line for both countries?
India is a very long-term horizon for any new entry in the country. So we're really talking 10 years or 20 years. It's conceivable that target may be too high, but Prime Minister Modi was in Australia recently, the first prime ministerial visit in 28 years.
That's right.
He left saying, you know, we're going to finish this trade deal in 1 year. So the audacity, you know, and the impatience is extremely welcomed. And that's what American business are thinking about this administration. It reminds me, though, of the challenge, which is 1964, my organization took a trade mission to India as a guest of Prime Minister Nehru. And they reported to the White House that if the structural reforms could even be moved just a fraction, by 2000, India would be among the top 5 economies. You know, that the government needed to tame the bureaucracy. So in preparing for this trip, I spoke to 25 companies, and they said, you know, Peter, if Modi could just tame the bureaucracy, we would be much better off. And then in terms...
You know what, you won't be a very popular man once the session's over, because this hall is full of a lot of ex-bureaucrats. So.
Well, that's okay.
Visa revoked.
Yeah. Well, the only last thing I'd say about this is in talking with people about where they see business opportunities. Number 1 is defense. Number 2 is defense. Number 3, insurance, cybersecurity, and building hospitals, actually.
All right. Rick, you know, the emerging trade architecture seems to be free trade arrangements. There's the TPP, which the US is pushing in a big way. India is sort of sitting out on the sidelines on the TPP. Walk us through how the trade architecture is going to change over the next, say, 10 to 15 years, and what role America sees for India in this emerging free trade zone, as it were.
I think right now Americans don't see a role for India. I think, you know, right now the United States is looking at 3 of the largest free trade agreements that we've ever signed, and we're negotiating them simultaneously. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which may reach its conclusion this year, although I think that landmark was set a couple of years ago before. Yeah. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with Europe, and also the one that's, I think, least understood, but I think today where India has the strongest offensive interest is the Trade and Services Agreement. There's also another very important agreement, too, the Information Technology Agreement, the update to it, the second version of that. You know, India wants to be a major IT manufacturing hub, and yet is not participating in the talks. That's really going to unleash, you know, the forces for global development on IT products right now. So I think there's a lot going on, some of the biggest deals that we've ever seen in the globe's history, and India's not party to any of those. And I think even if India were to raise its hand today and say, we'd like to enter TPP negotiations, irrespective of the fact there really isn't an on-ramp this late, but once it's done even, that's where things like the walk-away from the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, people look at that and say, you know, this government may be pro-business, but it doesn't appear to be particularly pro-trade. So it would be very difficult, I think, even later on, to enter those talks.
Ambassador Sood, you want to take that point forward?
I think that, you know, the trade facilitation agreement that you talked about, I would have a very different take on it. Now, here was an issue that was flagged at the highest level when Prime Minister Modi was there in September. You know, I think in their bilateral discussions, the 2 leaders talked about the importance of resolving it. Prime Minister Modi was able to explain to President Obama the importance of food security in India and the kind of programs that we have for the poor people. And I think it was understood. Now, that then led to the breakthrough. So I think the trade facilitation agreement is, to my mind, an example of how, when there is a clear understanding of the political compulsions at the level of the top leadership, then I think it is possible to find ways of getting around it. And that is key.
Dr. Adama, how do you negate this impression that's going around the world that India is still sort of hesitant about being open for business?
I think when we began our reforms in 1991, the general thing was that, look, we're going to do it at our own pace while we have to deal with the outside world. Just leave us alone. Trust us, we're going to do reforms, but let's do it our own pace, because changing the internal structures were going to be complex. But I think what's happening now is the rest of the world has moved ahead so much.
Yeah.
And that we've not, if we don't play catch up, I think the problem of doing that 20 years down the road is going to be a lot harder. So I think the challenge is this, that if you want to adapt to the rest of the world and be part of it, you've got to keep doing your internal reform. That is a trade facility. If you don't change the way you organize your food security, You can keep complaining to the rest of the world and say, look, I don't like it.
Yeah.
But I think the trick is, how do you synergize the domestic reform, so that you are up to standards with the way the rest of the world is going? So I think the hope is there is a government which is saying, I'm going to reorganize my food security. I got to reorganize my IPR. I got to reorganize my domestic stuff. And I think once the previous governments did not have the political capital, these guys have it. So I would say that adaptation of bringing in sync will have to start.
So I agree with Dr. Rajamon. I think here the resolution of the trade facilitation was, we did not want artificially imposed deadlines on us in terms of which would have taken away the food security arrangements for a large part of the poor population.
Okay.
But so, you know, the fact that we managed to get this window without an artificial deadline provides us with the opportunity where we can rationalize the system.
All right.
One doesn't go without the other. The two go together.
Vikram.
What that breakthrough in the WTO for the trade facilitation agreement showed, I think, was the ability of the two governments to get things done. I mean, this is starting to seem like an insurmountable barrier. But I think there's a nugget in here that's important for us to think about. A lot of these reforms are often cast as things that India has to do to catch up to the rest of the world, things that India has to do to benefit from the, you know, what some other country wants. That is really not what it is about. What it's about is, what does India need to do for India's own industry? IPR reform and changes should be made so that Indian companies down the line are going to be able to protect their intellectual property, because India starts to think of itself as a country that is generating intellectual property worth protecting on its own. It is about India's transcendence into being a real world power in terms of everything from manufacturing to defense to whatever it is you look at. And that's a different lens to look through at these sorts of obligations.
And if I can, there's also a point, I think, you know, I wasn't trying to sound overly critical. You know, they walked away from the multilateral deal, but in terms of opening domestically, there's actually been a lot of great movements. And I think, you know, what a lot of Americans don't understand as well is this massive trade deficit. I mean, we've been pushing for India to liberalize its economy and open up for decades. I've been a part of that for almost 20 years now. And, you know, the fear had been 20 years ago, well, if we open up, it's not really trade with America, it's trade with China that we're most concerned about. And I think those fears that were relayed to us back then have almost exactly been met. You know, your country's trade deficit is about 10% of GDP. Ours is about 3%, and we pull our hair out over our trade deficit. So, you know,
you're not talking about yourself.
Yeah, well, I had it back then, but you know, so we do have to remain cognizant that these are real fears that get brought up.
Okay, so let me now move to the other area, which is again going to be, which is going to feature in a big way in the bilateral summit, is climate change and renewable energy. And I'll start again with you, Peter. We had the big deal between the United States and China back in November. Do you expect something on those lines between India and the United States? Is India's development at that stage where it can commit to a year or a timeline?
You know, I'm not familiar with the talks on the topic of renewables and climate change, but of course I think that the drop in the price of oil has been a boon for India, so I just encourage everyone to take advantage. But
in terms of American companies wanting to invest in India's renewable sector, because that's going to be a big thrust, like I said, what synergies do American companies bring to the table? We know that, for example, the United States and China have a huge problem on the solar front. Would India open up as a potential market, not just to sell stuff, but also to transfer technology?
these are complex systems, so you have to have alignment among regulators, local authorities. The power needs to be distributed. You need access to land. So, you know, each of these things are, what they would say is that developing a renewable system is not an engineering challenge.
Okay. Dr. Rajamohan, I mean, again, all of this is happening in the context of the climate negotiations that are going to happen in Paris, right? And no big deal, let's say a good enough deal, is going to happen without India being on board. You think the US-China deal has changed the dynamic?
Exactly, and I think where the US and China, the way they're engaging, I think this acquires a strategic character that, as the big boys, they're going to set the terms of how the rest of the world is going to deal with it. I think for us, the challenge is this, that look, that we're not in the position of China.
Yeah.
That the Chinese are, 4 times bigger than our GDP, the bigger manufacturing economy. So we got to keep growing, and we need more electricity. So now the trick, I think, that's being tried out by the two sides is, look, India will continue to produce more power. Large part of it will be coal.
Yeah.
But can we find a way to reduce the relative weight of coal in the total power production in India? So I think the deal that you can exploit, it can't be a China-type deal.
Yeah.
It has to be a different deal where India and the US work together to expand the non-conventional sources component, the renewable component within the overall energy mix. And that's where the nuclear stuff comes in, the solar stuff comes in, the wind stuff comes in. And I think if we can work out a framework here, because historically we've been on opposite sides,
True.
India and the US on the climate change debate and the multilateral thing, but probably there is a ghost of a chance that this might produce a reasonably simple but at a first step forward where we can even imagine we can work together.
Well, China embarked on its process of energy-intensive industrialization decades ago. And today, in India, the industry sector accounts for something like about 15–16% of our GDP. And we want to take it up to 25%. Now, clearly, this is going to require a certain amount of energy input. But as Dr. Rajamohan says, not all of it has to come from coal. And just to put it in perspective, in terms of per capita emissions, India's figures are below 2 tons. I mean, it's something like 1.5, 1.6 tons. China's figures today are something like 7 tons. And US figures today are something like 18 tons. And the US-China deal, what it talks about, is bringing them to a level which would be somewhere near about 12 or 13.
Yeah.
It is a far, far cry from where we are. So I think what we need to do is look for clean sources of energy, and that will be the area where we will find maximum convergence, potential convergence between India and the United States.
I can tell you from personal example, having lived in Beijing for the last 3 years, this was also the #1 public concern. Bad air quality was the #1 public concern, and that put immense pressure on the government of China, and that's why you're seeing this deal. But to sort of get closing comments from our panel, I'll start with you, Rick. How do we judge the success or failure of this visit? I mean, would there be 1, 2, 3 tangibles that you'd want to see?
Yeah, there are. And I mean, you don't have two bosses getting together in such a short period of time unless they're going to close the deal on some important things. Now, we continue to live in the shadow of the 2005 announcement of the nuclear agreement.
Right.
There aren't that many things, and I can't think of another one that's quite of that level. I mean, to break the nuclear nonproliferation arrangement to bring in one country. So, if we get co-development announcement, if we conclude, move forward on liability, all these things are terrific and great, and that's kind of like what big deliverables are going to look like these days, and I suspect we're going to get a few of those. All
right. I've got 4 minutes for 4 guests, so a minute each. What would be your barometer for the success of this visit?
The success has been achieved already.
Already?
And the emergence of the Prime Minister as a regional power and somebody who's a man of history and a man of action is going to lead to great things. And the weight will generate results of the kind that Rick has been talking about.
Ambassador Sood?
Well, the success is, in a sense, the fact that, as was mentioned in the panel, India is back on the radar screen. So now we have that. And what we need to make sure is we need to reinvigorate the momentum which seemed to have flagged in recent years, so that each of these deals, whether it is renewal of the Defense Cooperation Agreement, or whether it is the nuclear liability, or movement on climate change, or trade, and so on, health, education, the agenda is vast, so that these are seen not as transactions, but as milestones in developing the partnership that the two leaders have envisaged for themselves.
All right. So essentially, Vikram, what Ambassador Sood is saying is, can the systems, can the bureaucracies match the dynamism of both leaders?
Well, and I think I'd go back to my, is it going to be good or is it going to be great? I think the visit is going to be a success. There's no doubt about that. And it could be a tremendous success if there's breakthroughs on nuclear liability issues, if there's a real, upgrading of the defense framework, if there's some really specific announcements. But regardless, we have to remember this is not a sprint. This is a long-term partnership. This is something about years, decades, not months. Not weeks and months. And so the trajectory we're on, I think, puts us in a position where we will be actually strategic partners over time. I think the energy level that we're seeing now suggests that we'll continue to have high-level engagement and investment in making progress on all of these issues. So even the ones that don't, if things that don't get done this time are going to be high priorities, are going to continue moving forward.
All right. I think on symbolism, we've already done it. I think President of the United States being for the Republic Day for the first time, that itself is, is an important thing. We've had the Chinese here for the Republic Day. We've had the Pakistanis here for the Republic Day, but never had the Americans. Yeah. So I think the fact that we asked and he's agreed, that itself is a big deal. Second part, I think first is finish the overhang, like the nuclear stuff. It's 10 years now, so I think we must get over it, and I think if we do that, that itself is a big achievement. Okay. And then put new objectives like upgrading the defense relationship and work together in the multilateral arena.
All right, I'm afraid we'll have to wrap it up at that, but thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a fascinating discussion, and hopefully some of these points will find their way in the bilateral agenda when President Obama and Prime Minister Modi meet at Hyderabad House for continuing coverage of that visit. It's a historic visit already, like some of our panelists have said. Continue to watch Network 18 channels. From all of us here, thank you very much. This was a special presentation by the Observer Research Foundation and Network 18. Thank you. Good night.